me jokers to the right and Rishi in the middle, we are dealing with people who can't govern, even if they wanted to govern in the best interest.
It's the same old Tory party, always putting their rich mates and donors before working people.
It's conscious cruelty. This system is imposed with conscious cruelty.
Dr. Nicola Headlam.
I have been working on subnational economic policy development for 20 years.
Looking at the UK this past 14 years, what has gone wrong?
Gosh, just the small questions then. Austerity, Brexit, COVID, the big ABC of the last period, have all been poorly managed, both in terms of the political decisions and then the economic fallout. It is extremely hard to find a way back from there. The banking crisis of 2008.
Fear came back into the market in a very big way.
Britain's big banks under sustained attack on the markets. As we go on air, there are crisis talks about how to stabilise the banking system.
What the heck is going on down here?
We've been in a low growth period from then to now. In short, you need to bail out the poor. You need to recapitalise the poor. And how do you do that? You do it by...
We initially came into contact with one another through a mutual acquaintance, Tom. The idea of getting you onto Alison's podcast, and having listened to what you had to say on that one, I couldn't resist but having a conversation myself. So thank you very much for taking the time to join me today.
Any friend of Tom's is a friend of mine. Pleasure.
So before we dive into the crux of it, let's maybe start with a background into what you do and why.
I am a bit of a freelance. I have been working on, the fancy Sunday name is Subnational Economic Policy Development for 20 years in various hats and guises, the longest of which was postdocing and doing university-led research, but always with an eye on policy, because I came from a local government background in kind of regeneration years of New Labour and didn't really see such a hard distinction between people finding stuff out and people changing stuff on the ground. It's not really like that at the moment for reasons that we can discuss. But yes, I've managed to have a what euphemistically described as a portfolio career, advising people on the spatial consequences of various sets of economic thinking. And fortunately, people are vaguely interested in that, and there is a head of steam behind some change.
So broadly speaking, looking at the UK between the pre-2010s to now, this kind of past 14 years, from your experience, what has gone wrong?
Gosh, just the small questions then. But the banking crisis of 2008, we haven't had more than a percentage point of growth in the country. And we've gone up and down and fractions here and there. Some sectors did all right for a bit, but essentially we've been in a low growth period from then to now. So the first thing I wonder is, why isn't that obvious? Why doesn't everybody know that? Because certainly listening to the speeches of several of our recent ex-prime ministers, particularly Boris, he was always trying to talk things up. I get it. He wanted to be, the famous line for Boris, he wanted to be a Brexity Hezza. So back to our earlier conversation about Heseltine, that's who Boris had wanted to be, a Brexity Hezza. So post-banking crisis 2008, there's all kinds of sliding doors moments, isn't there, between then and now? But one of them was when the outcome of the election in 2010 was unclear. I left my office to go to the pub, and I was completely convinced that Brown was going to stand down, cede to Ed Miliband, and there was going to be a Rainbow Coalition government. And by the time I'd got to the pub and ordered a pint to celebrate, we were in the Rose Garden. The Libs had gone with this extremely neoliberal trajectory and created what they were very anxious to present as a very stable, and they did all their negotiations in private, coalition, which was only one of the possible worlds that we could have had. And as I say, God knows if we'd had a Miliband Balls Rainbow Coalition, where we would be now, because most of what followed was a series of Conservative Party psychodramas being played out as if they were the most important thing. And of course, the biggest of these is Brexit. But by allowing themselves to focus on something that is an economic fiction, everything that follows is in a bit of a weird place. Not least that, and this is a really quite offensive analogy, there's been more than one Joy Division. So each Prime Minister shore off the ones that couldn't be in, because for various reasons, right? Once you've done that a few times, you're just left with absolute dross. And that would be true wherever you had started. The Cameron-Osborne intake in 2010, buttressed by Vince Cable, etc., there was some quality in that cabinet. But by now, we are dealing with people who can't govern, even if they wanted to govern in the best interest. The governing capacity, I would argue, is collapsed. And that is because each time there was a prime minister, it's as if they'd started off and said, everybody with brown hair step this way. And then another prime minister in, it'd be like, from those brown-haired people, let's have the blue-eyed people. All of this is a very long-winded way of saying Rishi is possibly the most friendless prime minister we've ever had in terms of actual political soulmates within his party. And of course, we've seen him reaching back into the pre-Brexit cabinet for the stability that's been needed since the debacle of Truss and Kwarteng. So the banking crisis was a global thing, but the financial crisis in this country was largely made in Westminster because the response was entirely the wrong response. And by which I mean austerity, with interest rates at zero, money free, that is the time to build HS2, to build Northern Powerhouse Rail. And again, slightly continuous timeline because that's what Osborne was all about. But obviously he then was shorn off post-Brexit. Again, number one, if we'd had an Ed Balls Miliband Rainbow Coalition in 2010, and if we didn't get that, if we had an empowered Osborne interventionist Northern Powerhouse set of policies, there's two ways it could have been better. We didn't get either of those. And the bit that I know the most about was the end of the Theresa May era, when, having inflicted Brexit on us, it wasn't enough that they had this lunatic thing that was irrelevant to most people, but the way that the deal making, the substantive votes this period, is just a theft of bandwidth for the political class from anything that mattered to something that didn't. Again, if you offered people membership of the European Union or their mortgage being £700 more than it was between two dates, they would say, I don't care about the European Union, it's my current account that affects me. But we're in this place where we're out of the EU with a messy set of treaties and everybody is broke. And I'm not saying it's because of Brexit. The three things since then, so austerity, Brexit, COVID, the big ABC of the last period, have all been poorly managed, both in terms of the political decisions and then the economic fallout. And then compounded together, the ABC of those three once in a lifetime, once in a generation events within a couple of years, it is extremely hard to find a way back from there. And as you remember, no government has ever survived a stock market crash. Rishi trying to patch it all up and make the best of it post Truss and Kwarteng, it would have been better just to go to the country then, because the inevitable election defeat, they should just have faced that they created a panic in the markets and then asked the electorate to see how keen they are on that. As it is, we're in this sort of zombie parliament with this zombie government and a continued focus on small boats and the hostile environment. I have this slight anxiety dream where Keir gets a pile of manila folders and each one of them has got one word on the cover. One says prisons, one says drugs, one says child poverty, one says getting to Leeds on the train. And the pile is so deep that I don't know how you would prioritise actually from where we are. Because, and again, my husband makes us watch Channel 4 News as we have our supper, which is just about enough to finish anyone off at the end of the day. Because once you've got round the horrific Gaza and Ukraine news, you're then into just essentially a public service by public service explaining the ways in which they are falling over. And, sometimes it's prisons, and the Chief Inspector of Prisons has been extremely vocal about how the prison estate isn't fit for purpose, too many people in, too many suicides inside. Those things are such avoidable, but it's like in a risk analysis. Having a relative that is imprisoned and then killing themselves is very rare in terms of its frequency, but it's so devastating for everybody involved. And just this week, there's been all this stuff about this maternity review. They're saying that all these terrible outcomes of birth trauma, and there's sort of very pleasant people who've put together the evidence base are like, we need massive investment in maternity services. And it just feels like anytime you turn a corner, almost literally in our cities, there's something which could take all the money that there is and still need more. So with public services are absolutely on their knees, I do feel very anxious about what is inherited by Labour, who currently are 20 points clear in the polls and likely to win this extremely poor hand. And as I say, my date, everybody wants to talk about the date of the election. My own view is that the friendless Prime Minister cannot survive a Conservative party conference. So I think that they'll have to go to the country the first week in September, because the difference between Keir looking prime ministerial and presidential and keeping the Labour Party in line for a completely well-managed set piece, which is what Labour have been doing very cleverly, and the Tories literally would be a flying circus with Boris people on one side, clowns to the left of me, jokers to the right, and Rishi in the middle. They only managed to hang on in Manchester last year by having these very divisive. Cancelling HS2 probably bought Rishi a few more months as Prime Minister. It was that sort of important, because it's not so much pulling rabbits out of hats as getting rabbits out of hats and punching them in the face. And that has continued his tenure as Prime Minister. He's so on borrowed time, it's absurd. The other gossip I heard is that they're supposed to be in Birmingham for the Conservative Party conference and they haven't paid the full bill yet. So maybe they're thinking that they won't have a party conference after all. So that's what I think. I think stick it on to the end of the school holidays. The kids love an extra day off. And finally, we'll get a chance to put this government out of its misery. Also, for what it's worth. And again, so the incoming Labour administration has just everything to do. But my feeling is as well that Keir will be at a similarly low ebb within the 2 years of midterm. So my other concern is, as well as getting sensible economic policies, making sure that the world isn't burning on too many fronts internationally, which frankly is horrific. And that's having its effect on commodity prices and on economics that aren't domestically framed. Finally getting some movement back for the bank rate and interest rates, so that there isn't just a policy of basically impoverishing the entire middle class that pay mortgages from salaries. Paying a mortgage from a salary marks you out in this economy as just the biggest loser, because investors are having bumpy years left, right and centre, and those locked out of the housing market are just sliding into ever-increasing precarity. But by trying to curtail the spending of the middle classes with interest rates, so therefore more of your money is going to your mortgage provider than to your cafe and all the things in the local economy that you'd normally support. It's disastrous, both fiscal and economic policy, basically. Completely in the wrong place, punishing completely the wrong people, because there's a third of people who are homeowners outright who continue to spend like drunken sailors, which is why inflation hasn't come down, because it's not sufficiently well understood, or if it is, it's being ignored, that you can have a consumption-led. It's having a bear market and a bull market at the same time. I'm very cross about all that, because it just, again, not facing the sort of core economic realities that face households, small businesses, people wanting to better their positions, and how that has spatial and sectoral consequences outside London and the southeast. There's nothing more important than that. And we've seen very paltry PR campaigns, essentially, both Levelling Up and Northern Powerhouse, for what it was worth, were more branding and marketing than substantive economic policy shifting the dial. And as you say, the outcomes are in the wrong place in terms of life chances, in terms of, we call in economics the two-body problem, the thing that you've described. So your wife gets a good job as a doctor, but then you're scratching around for something that's going to fulfill you. And it's the two-body problem everywhere in the country apart from London and the southeast. Because if, God forbid, an academic gets sorted, their partner, whatever they do, it's always... So the two-body problem is you both want fulfilling good careers, or whatever you want to do with your life, but both of you being sorted within a 10-mile radius of each other is highly unlikely outside of London and the southeast, or has been. maybe we're starting to see it change, but short, I started about 10 minutes ago. The bottom line is that a lot, so we call it, when you look at public policy, we call it the arsehole's view of public policy, whereby you start off by saying, I wouldn't start from here. So I haven't quite done that. But given that I don't think that there's been really much done right since 2008. And as I say, we could have had a Rainbow Coalition. We could have had an investing activist chancellor with George Osborne. The Brexit wars were just a dead decade in terms of what the economy was up to, because everybody was trading absolute fictions about an economy. That was the first time I started to feel really scared, was remember when David Cameron went and did his negotiation with Europe, which was essentially trying to make him look tough in front of the big boys at the back of the class in the Conservative Party. And I was thinking, these economic tests are nothing to do with what the economy is about. And of course, a few prime ministers along, and you've got Boris with his almost sexual fetish for wearing high vis all the time, like the village people. But essentially, I think he thought he was a minor character in Bob the Builder or Postman Pat, because his view of the economy was always knocking things down or building things up or playing with diggers. Fair enough, construction is a major sector, but everybody knows that in general, the prosperity of this country is made by nerds on laptops who might be digital nomads or whatever. They don't look like a fat git in a high-vis jacket. And even builders don't look like that. Builders, as you will know, are the buffest bunch of hot yoga doing fit people, because they are doing a very physically demanding job. The notion of this, I say, this sort of cosplay of activity that Boris took on to himself at a time when he had basically no economic strategy whatsoever. And I don't mean because of the pandemic, because he didn't have one. Like, what did they take us for? He was just this jester bouncing about in a hard hat with not a clue what he wanted to do with the economy, because it was like almost like a cartoon to him. I'm very cross about all that, as you can tell.
No, I'm the same, because having grew up in the north in Cumbria, I had to go through those austerity years we mentioned before the call, having grown up not too far away from like places like Whitehaven, Spatria, Cockermouth, etc. There's just a poverty of opportunity there. People have had all of their hopes and dreams removed, and therefore there's a knock-on effect as to what do they do with their lives? What can they get out of life? And we see at the moment things like there was a report out the other day that said that the UK has the second worst mental health in the world, in front of only Uzbekistan. And people wonder why. And the crux, in my view and experience, comes down to the fact that opportunity has been taken away unnecessarily. So if we look at the North and managed decline, then there's a purposeful route to centralisation of wealth and power that we're seeing the knock-on effects today. We've seen it since austerity, we've seen it since Brexit. And again, it comes down to me, a simple principle between, are you in it for the power or are you in it for the progress? Because if you're in it for the progress, then you're looking at the elevation of others rather than self. But what we've had to endure over the last 14 years is a psychodrama, and we see it in every announcement. It's not appeasing and trying to please or speak to the public. It's speaking directly to those small groups of factions within the Conservative Party in hope of getting their support to continue this route and maintenance of power. And I think it's so sad.
I don't know if you're a Sopranos person, but in the first series, Meadows says to Tony Soprano, "Dad, are you in the mafia? Are you in organised crime?" And he turns and says, "Don't kid yourself, honey, it's not that organised." And I think managed decline, we can see decline everywhere. It's not that managed. It's been quite chaotic in terms of decisions being taken that have had profound spatial consequences without a spatial lens being applied to them. And until and again, for lots of reasons, but not good ones, the lack of a national spatial plan, the lack of land use planning, the kind of denigration of planning in local authorities, which can be pro-growth and can be helpful and all the rest of it, but it's just been all part of this very mean austerity measures against local government, which were just targeted in a time when the government could have borrowed to invest all manner of things. When money was free, they chose not to. And by imposing that austerity on that time period, that's lost a lot of years of potential good progress and then put us into a completely weird place for Brexit, which they imposed on us. And then, of course, the coronavirus, it is a once in a generation event, but we were in such poor state. But while that showed us that those people were just horrific partying gits, it did show in terms of the local response that there is still life in the local state, and there's still life in those networks, those community organising, and people appreciated their 15-minute neighbourhood more than ever and their neighbours and things like that. In some ways, although you can't do very much about the kind of horrific self-harm Tory party disconnectedness from the material realities, you can't make them, what was your formulation? Progress or power. If it's about, are you trying to prove a point or are you trying to solve a problem? It's as simple as that, really. Even if the problem is, what are we going to have for dinner? You can create horrible conflict out of any problem. But again, by framing Brexit as the biggest thing that needed fixing, they were making a point, not solving a problem. It was a problem that didn't need to be fixed. The deterrent piece, it's now become so emblematic that Rishi needs to show something to somebody by getting planes off the ground, whatever. But what he's attempting to demonstrate is something horrible. It's a horrible policy, and it's supposed to deter people from coming because it's worse to go to Rwanda than to stay here. It's cost billions. It's to get a couple of planes full of people who are the most vulnerable, marginalised people. There's been snatch squads of people to get them ready for these, and there's always a sort of spectrum between politicians who are more performative and politicians who are more substantive. But I think since 2010, the performative has just multiplied and the substantive has just waned to the point where it does feel like press release, no one can believe that they've survived the day and will regroup another day, which is not a recipe for governing. It's a recipe for hanging on.
That was the thing that really surprised me during the local elections. They finished third behind the Lib Dems, and I remember seeing Rishi flying up to Teesside to stand beside Ben Houchen as this heralded win. But at the end of the day, if people pay attention to Ben Houchen, obviously there's other bits and pieces in the locker that Private Eye have had an extensive look at. But then more there's the element how he ran his campaign. There was no association with the Conservative Party. Even when he was stood on the platform to herald in his win, there was no blue rosette, there was nothing. So that separation between central policy and politics was what ultimately separated him from the voters. But it doesn't take away from the fact that they were absolutely pulverized. So the thing that frustrates me is this, I guess it's a lack of accountability, because if we look at the money that's being wasted, this is money that's needed to be invested into getting the UK back on its feet, because the UK is on its knees at the moment, 2.6 trillion in debt. We are on our knees, and looking at getting people back on their feet does not involve shoving money through VIP contracts to friends and donors. It does not involve spending ludicrous sums of money on a failed Rwanda scheme. Because if you really wanted to address migration, you have to take a long-term view on it, and the fact that as the world changes, as the temperatures rise, there will be a movement of people throughout various parts of the world to new locations. So if you really wanted to solve it, it would be a collective that came together and said, we'll take a percentage share of our national headcount. So we've got 67, 68 million. We'll take 1 or 2% of that annually. That's how you solve it.
When I looked at what the economic consequences are going to be of the pandemic in this country, I became convinced that they should form a government of national unity because it was so important. And I don't really recall anyone ever mentioning it again, but that would have been so much better than allowing this. And I'm sure Labour didn't argue for it for their own reasons. And let's face it, this always gets to be the problem, is that a good Labour Party is necessary but not sufficient for progressive change to happen. But yes, the point is exactly, climate change is the ultimate, but economic inequality is as big an elephant in the room that needs a complete whole governing philosophy to try to tackle it, and you still might not do that. If you're completely just look over there, throwing dead cat after dead cat in the mix, bouncing dead cats, or what was I saying? Bunnies having their faces punched. The point is that we've been in this extremely dangerous, fantastical conversation whereby, yes, you're right, the Conservative Party are in dialogue with sections of the right-wing press and no one else. And it sounds really prissy, but governing properly, making choices, funding, doing recovery plans for prisons and maternity services, and all of this stuff is deeply unfashionable, really hard work, and costs a fortune and takes ages. This is what I mean about the manila file nightmare. Not one of those manila files opens up to a simple, here's the lever, just pull it or push it, or the sort of permanent polycrisis that we are in terms of both resourcing and taxation, because we've just been painted into this completely weird place where you aren't allowed to talk about tax. And again, it's like there was a Jeremy Hunt budget when there was 1 million public servants out on strike, including the teachers, and he chose not to refer to it from the dispatch box. And it's just so extraordinary that we've become used to the framing of a problem not being challenged, and that's partly a media thing, or it really does feel like just a series of disconnected press releases and no delivery plan, no action plan, no serious long-term anything. We just deserve better than that. You deserve better than that in your town hall and in that stupid crumbling Hogwarts that they've got down there. They've lost the plot, and they've lost the connection to the fact that taxation pays for public services, and you've either got to set that so that broader shoulders bear the most responsibility, or you've got to deal with multinational tax avoidance on a massive scale. But first you need to work out, what do you want to achieve? Do you want to achieve healthier, happier people all over the country? Because if so, then you need a policy prospectus which suggests that, and it needs to be honest about the trade-off. And so in some ways, it just feels any time there's been a policy that might be going to benefit, including things like the housing reforms, the default evictions and all the rest of it, in the end, when it really comes to it, they back away from legislating. And again, it feels like that has been a complete waste of energy and effort. And although the result is managed decline, it has been chaotically managed decline, which couldn't really be worse if you set out to destroy and make your economy as unequal as it can be. So yes, you're right. Some of the answers in devolution of power to mayors, and hopefully, but again, in the austerity period, the ideological trashing of development corporations, the RDAs and the Audit Commission, this is an example of how wrong it was to dissolve the Audit Commission, because at the moment in local government, only 5% of councils have got signed off accounts, because private accountancy firms are like, that's definitely above my pay grade and I don't want to get it wrong. Their professional indemnity suggests there's no glory in pointing out when a council could be teetering on the edge of bankruptcy, but we don't even know.
It was about 20, I think, that's like
and what was interesting was at the turn of the year, the Tories were really excited that this was going to be a great attack line for them. And if you remember, Rishi tried it in PMQs. You bankrupted Birmingham, you bankrupted Bradford, and you'd bankrupt the whole country. But then the work was done on what were the councils that owed more than £1 billion, and they are boroughs of Surrey, because 7 boroughs in Surrey went on a very interesting purchasing spree, encouraged presumably by their members of parliament, but I don't have any proof of specifics, but they all went for a diversification of income stream strategy pre-pandemic, and found themselves buying absolutely worthless commercial property. It's not a case of, those big Labour metropolitan councils run by Labour are going bankrupt. It's quite the opposite. It's slightly dodgy deals done on golf courses that have left the 7 boroughs of Surrey exposed to billions, which is why they've gone very quiet actually about this now, because unscrambling all of that by tapering and creating the graph of doom that we were also familiar with for local government finance, this directly is a causal connection. And again, I think they're relying on people not remembering. But if there was an audit commission, then it would be much clearer. Presumably, if we've only got 5% of councils that have done their accounts, then there's more to come. And of course, anyone worth their salt is going to hide that until it's a change of government. It's just absurd. And again, coming from a set of quite ideological things about local government should be much more commercial and more businesslike, and the sort of Nick Ridley enabling state thesis where you meet once a year to set up all the contracts and then you don't need to meet again because you've got a very minimalist notion of local democracy. And all of that has fed into... So austerity wasn't across the public services, it was retained because of the health service being protected in that period. And what's fascinating is that, I was just saying this to someone the other day, universities who are now in serious peril, and there will be universities going bust, and some universities putting 20% of their staff on notice and things like that, because the foreign students won't come because of the hostile environment. That's been bankrolling most of British higher education for 20 years. It feels to me like universities are in the sort of slight bewildered phase that local government was in 2010, 11, 12, where they were like, this doesn't add up, this doesn't make sense, and became a completely demoralized force through austerity. And I'm seeing the same stuff in universities now, because people can't make the books balance in the absence of the foreign students, and foreign students will not come if the mood music is so hostile. The differences between the right and wrong sort of immigration has been blurred a lot. There is a sense that people aren't welcome to come and pursue their careers here. So we're just this poor, starving, stinking rock with no immigrants coming.
Looking at the UK, we've talked quite a bit about the challenges, but I just think not only about that power versus progress analogy that we said at the beginning, but I also think there's a distinct lack of vision, of aspiration. When we look at what could be achieved and what we look at things like impact and legacy, what we could actually drive from politics, that's the beauty of politics. It can change people's lives if done correctly in a positive way, and not so negative that we see today. But I look at it and I want to see politicians, and I also want to see policy that is driven more towards the longer path rather than this kind of short-termism that we see at the moment. This is the stuff that should get you motivated in the morning. Yeah, things are carnage, but let's fix it. Looking at it now, yeah, there's just too many psychodramas going on. And I think a lot of it comes down to leadership. A, the leaders that we have today, as you've already articulated, are not fit for purpose. And also B, from an empathetic stance, they don't really take the time to understand people and the challenges that they face.
Some of these challenges are made more difficult if you end up allying yourself with anti-human forces. And arguably, the market is anti-human in that the market can go, as we're seeing at the moment, the market in terms of investment, in terms of, you've never had it so good, in terms of return on investment. But all the negative consequences that are felt in households and small businesses and communities. So there's those that argue that market fundamentalism of the type that we've seen, neoliberalization kind of writ large, is anti-human in that it privileges the market rather than people. But then technology has its anti-humanness as well. And if you've behaved in there's a sort of biopolitics to who is in charge, and if you've had quite a naked biopolitics of the pandemic, I don't feel particularly confident that the next phase won't be even more anti-human. And whether your God is the market or technology, they are both wrong. It's wrong to follow either. And again, the conflation of the two is quite scary. What I'm loving at the moment is this meme I was telling my husband last night of John Connor watching you talk to your AI from Terminator. I think because society is so unequal and so divided, there is a real gap in terms of empathy for other people, and people would rather retreat into technology or retreat into market forces than they would try to unravel the messy business of being humans and why it might matter to us what humanness is. There's a lot of talk about adulting, but not a lot about being human. And human qualities, I think, all the chat about AI will successfully repeat and all the rest of it. And it is, it's extraordinary what you can get. But if you're writing complete boilerplate marketing text, then yes, your AI puts you out of business. But the human element is you're able to code switch, you're able to understand context, you're able to layer the intertextuality of human communication and culture. is something which is a human category. And like with Make Me a Nick Cave song and all the rest of it, AI is a thinner version of reality than humanness is. And I feel that a lot of comparative advantage, certainly between people and between nations, is going to be in this code switching. I don't think in your own life, people that have either divorced parents or they've lived in different countries or, God forbid, had a really catastrophic breakdown, you code switching, and that is empathy. And then you have networks of humans that can connect with each other. And yes, humanness, it seems slightly odd to emphasize that it's one of the things that are getting us out of this. But an economy for humans would be an interesting thought experiment for northern humans as well. That would be another thing, because most of the time when people are talking about the economy, the model that they've got in their head is something like in trading places or people in the stock market going buy, sell. But actually, it's just a web of interactions. It's a web of transactions. So I think thinking through some of that is interesting and useful, and it would lead you to doing different things. So a pro-human approach, i.e. not for the bottom line or for the shareholders who are another form of anti-human, because that's about how value gets transmitted. And that might sound a little bit esoteric, but I think that's the problem. There's become this gap between why you do things and then who, cui bono, as they say, who benefits.
Yeah, that's the crux of a lot of the issues that we see today, like the state of wealth inequality, not just within this country, but throughout the world. Like I remember when the pandemic was in its peak, the rise in numbers of millionaires and billionaires, whilst at the same time, people that in dire need of things like food banks and
that's the point, is that with this sort of this hyper accelerated moving apart from each other, we have trillionaires and we have these hundreds of thousands of food banks, which is needing to rely on association to get your daily bread, essentially.
That's why when I look at things, if you look at things like a desire for a wealth tax, there's 7.6 trillion in offshore at the moment. And when we're starting to talk about numbers, like Brexit is, depending where you're looking, it's a 4 or 5% hit, which generally is about 100 billion. But again, the numbers of 7.6 trillion in offshore, if we start understanding like taxation in a more clear and calm perspective and understand things like transfer pricing and how corporations move money around the world to avoid taxation.
So when the leader of the free world is saying, of course you don't want to pay much tax, our language for describing this stuff is poor. And there is this very extractive notion that it's take what you can because that's what someone else would do to you. And it's this paranoia and this fear that drives the notion that government spending will be wasteful. And a lot of this is just, these are categories that are rooted in emotional trauma and fear. And it's so ingrained, this notion of what it is to be human, that you can't really get at it. And so what I wanted to say was that rather than just hear us despair, there are all kinds of manuals for getting out of this issue. And I've got on my desk, I've got a list here, which is the A to E of heterodox, pro-human, pro-northern thinking, right? So just bear with me. It starts with a book called Alpha City by Roland Atkinson from Sheffield University. Brilliant. Alpha City, it's all about how the hierarchy gets maintained in space. Then Nassim Nicholas Taleb, Anti-Fragile, very important book. I've then got 2 books called Broke. One's by David Boyle and one's edited by Tom Clark. I'm in the Tom Clark one, saying we've managed to inure ourselves to teaching assistants and healthcare assistants using food banks, but they're being joined in the queue by nurses and teachers. And are we okay with that as well? Butler to the World by Oliver Bullock. Now, Butler to the World was what the accusation was of the kind of Cameron Osborne era. They're the Butler class to global capital. So that's your A and B, Alpha City, Anti-Fragile, Broke, Butler to the World. Then we get to C. Capital is the most important category in Capital. So there's Capital by Piketty, David Harvey, The Enigma of Capital. And then your most recent podcastee, The Corona Crash by Grace Blakely. And that's a sort of variant of the sort of crisis capitalism arguments put forward by Naomi Klein about shock doctrine, and then all consuming by Neil Lawson. So that's all your C's. D, donut economics. D for dream hoarders. D for end this depression now by Paul Krugman. And then E, edible economics. The economics of enough by Diane Coyle. The death of Homo economicus by Fleming. And then Joe Earl, Cal Moran, and Zach Ward Perkins, the Econocracy. Those guys set up the Alternative Economics for Everyone organization. And I did a couple of years ago teaching economics to non-community settings, to people that don't have education. And that community transmission of knowledge is one of the only ways that you can think your way out of it, I think. So that's my A, B, C, D, E of heterodox books to make you be able to connect yourself to this massiveness of the arguments. I'll put a link to them all if anybody wants to read up on them, and I'd be more than happy if there was demand to do a book club and talk about them. I think there's nothing better for thinking through how you feel than talking about these kinds of alternative paths. It's literally like the 5 whys. Keep asking why, and then again something about these heterodox economists. It gets you to a more satisfying place. So that's what I wanted to say. That there are lots of paths, and they say that's just A to E. There's a lot more.
I'll add a U and a V. So V being another one by Grace called Vulture Capitalism, which we just discussed in the past podcast. It's a great book because the thing I really enjoyed about that is the beginning was very much like this podcast, talking about the realities of and the turbulence of the whole piece, but then in the back end was about opportunities for hope and optimism in respect to, she calls it the architects and the bees, but about things like the Lucas Plan or things like the Preston model. And there's a lot of good stuff in there in respect to how communities are starting to understand these bigger problems and ultimately drive towards progressive action for change, which is really good.
I would commend anyone to the work of the Centre for Local Economic Strategies. Sarah Longland's the chief exec. They've been thinking about these knotty problems for a lot of years, and they've got some very readable solutions-focused pamphlets on their website. So Claire's is always a good source of hope and optimism.
And there's another one called Utopia for Realists by Rutger Bregman, which is unbelievable. I read that, actually, talking of trains earlier, I read it on a train back from a Tenacious D concert, which was amazing, to be honest.
It's in a different section, actually. Managed to get him one as well. It's underneath Richard Layard's Happiness, which is also very key to public policy. But the other one at that end of the alphabet, of course, is Techno-Feudalism by Yanis Varoufakis, which has got a brilliant analysis of all this pro-human, anti-human stuff. And he connects that to working out theory of value in a way that is satisfying under the conditions of cloud capitalism.
So looking at the UK as a whole, as a challenge we face now, if you were given that awesome position of advising the next government as to where to start, where would you start and why?
As I say, the layers of the manila envelopes, the folders scare me because some of the things that are terrible tragedies for families but are very rare are urgent as well. But in short, the mission needs to be, you need to bail out the poor. You need to recapitalise the poor. So people that do not have assets, you need to solve the housing crisis by having 1 million social homes need to be built over the next decade. And we need to work out how we're going to cope with the intergenerational wealth transfer of the boomers to their children. Because here's a specific thing. We've inured ourselves to the fact that you can't accrue enough capital in a single lifetime for the kind of life that one might aspire to. So the Bank of Mum and Dad isn't so much as of a nice to have, it's the biggest lender in the country. It outstrips mortgage lending. That generation, who are incredibly fortunate, we need to discuss the ways in which what happens to that wealth, because if it ends up solely improving, it'll end up in moving even more, putting even more space between the haves and the have-nots, unless you have a robust and serious program of recapitalising the poor. So that would be the most important thing. And how do you do that? You do it by focusing on, as I say, the housing problem, number one. You are looking for the small businesses to do 25%, 30% better than they do year on year and keep that money within communities. You have a revolution around business support. We don't have any problem with ideas for businesses in this country. Everyone's got a business idea, but getting it to the point where you are able to scale it and support a couple of workers and all the rest of it. And we need to work on that massively. And again, there should be access to very cheap funds for kind of entrepreneurs, but social entrepreneurs even better. But anyone really, there needs to be state-backed venture capital. Some of that uplift accrues to the Treasury. And to support all that, you need an industrial strategy, which is both spatial and sectoral in focus, which works with and through the extant networks on the ground. So the mayors, there's still some good work that was done by the Leps, even though they were completely unloved by the Tories from the beginning. And you need to coordinate local and regional support for business in an organised way, not reinventing development agencies, but being a bit more agile around supporting startups and scale-ups and high-value business. So businesses that are likely to grow at 20% in the next financial year can be anything. They're not sexy tech companies with a load of tech bros. They could be two chiropodists that take on two apprentices, and that's 20% growth. I'm thinking through ownership then. They could be a cooperative, they could be a collective, they could be a social enterprise, they could be a not-for-profit, but they can still be high growth. So decontaminating growth as a sort of dirty word, because moderate good growth that is able to connect with humans and communities is the best way. There's this notion, work is the best way out of poverty. It's not true. It's not true anymore. Inheriting property is the best way out of poverty. So we need to ensure, and again, with the housing market as it is, and property prices as they are, we need to encourage people to use buildings as places for ideas rather than just investments that is perfectly possible to buy to leave and to end up in a better place rather than supporting actual activity. And again, this is industrial policy for the 21st century, industrial strategy, which is clear about sectors and has some spatial differentiation by putting different things in different places. It links in with what we used to call smart specialisation from the EU. But all of that, you need to have confidence and you need to have a plan which is about a redistribution of wealth and opportunity. And I have every hope that is possible, but the people that don't think it's desirable are not going to go gentle into that good night. They're going to fight. The fight that's coming is for the soul within the Labour Party. Again, I'm a movement person. I'm not a Labour Party person. I'm a movement person. Some of the people that wrote those books, Kate and Neil Lawson, they've got a long history of activism within the movement rather than less than the party, because the movement needs to be there for the party. When they take power and they've got all the things hitting them, they need to feel that Fabians and trade unions and think tanks and all the rest of it can pass them some solutions for the governing project to come, which is where your idea of a Northern think tank is excellent. One that builds on the sort of research evidence and worst first and is able to say this is what you should do here now, rather than a competitive bloody fund which consultants help you to work up to some criteria. No. So local government well resourced, but with a focus on local growth and working together with expertise on connected and long range plans for what is the future of this place. And the other thing is, it's not always that it's going to cost a fortune. Obviously, big things like train lines and all the rest of it. I should say again, Northern taxpayers go and vandalise the Elizabeth line just for fun. It's an absolute outrage that in the time, the Crossrail obviously was an unfashionable thing, but in the time we've been arguing about should it go to Flaming Crew, Hull or wherever else, we've got nothing up here. And the Elizabeth line has completely transformed the economic geography of the west of London, putting Reading 15 minutes from Paddington, and we just all went, okay.
What was your analogy? I can't remember what you said on Alison's podcast about if if it goes underground in such and such, it's never going to happen in Manchester. What was that one again?
Because people in the Chilterns didn't want to see the trains, will never see the trains in Manchester. Some people get very nervy because it's a bit like it's a class war. And I just say, we're already in a class war and the upper class are winning.
There's the other piece as well to reference that was the Notting Hill statistic that you gave. So
this was a piece of work that was done in the Inequalities Institute and LSE, which is Mike Savage's research group. So Roland Atkinson works with them, so Alpha City, about the stretching and the attenuation of the top and the bottom. And it was widely reported in The Guardian, which was 4,600 houses in Notting Hill, so the big white ones like the Hugh Granty one, have made as much capital gains as the local authority districts of Manchester, Leeds and Newcastle. If you think of the number of properties within the envelope of the core local authority area, those snazzy houses that accrue to less than 5,000 people have made more over the last decade. And we need to bring the conversations together, I think, because it's easy to fall back into sort of old tropes. Anybody in this country who has got mortgage finance out on a house and pays it from a salary have got common cause with a fiscal and economic policy which is designed to deal with them rather than designed to enrich the investors and the shareholders. We're seeing an enormous upward movement of capital away from working masses to the top, to the 1%. And we need to have an analysis of why in order to have a chance of there being anything for the next generation, notwithstanding the horrific environmental sort of catastrophe that we're in. We don't have at the moment a sustainable economic plan for educating and then housing young people. The one shot of the baby boomers, property owning democracy, strong public services, that's done, that model is over. We need to work out who we are next and who gets to participate in the life of this country. And if we can't ask those questions of a Labour government as they come in, and the constraints are real, they are downplaying expectation management up the wazoo at the moment. Nobody wants to sound like it's a cakewalk, that you can never trust the electorate to fall in line, you need to respect every vote, etc. However, if, as is likely to happen, they will be the incoming government, they need critical friends to help them be brave on this stuff, because it's hard, because it involves changing things that have been enriching within the same pattern for decades, and time is up.
If we look back, just to be quick about it, but if we look back around about February 2023, the total government deficit since the beginning of COVID was 700 billion. So the question is, we've got to ask ourselves, where's that money gone? And who's it benefiting? Because at the moment, yeah, I agree, there'll be a massive power struggle when it comes to trying to usher in some of the changes that we've articulated, but the changes that's required. And it's not just like the general public that are saying this, it's more of a common conversation. Look at groups like the Patriots of Millionaires. They do understand that this kind of rising inequality, it doesn't end well for anybody.
Because you have to be mega rich to opt out of society completely. You're still on the bus with somebody who looks at your mobile phone and thinks, I want that. You're still in the street with somebody who's not an insured driver. You know what I mean? The point is, it can be very directly, very clearly, the interface between haves and have-nots can be very tricky. And in some ways, we've gone so far now that food bank users are at the one end of the spectrum, and then a sort of gilded age for the investor class, because they've had butlers to their capital in the political class. And the basic point is made. You can't accrue enough capital over a single lifetime to advance in terms of social mobility in this country. So therefore, anyone that doesn't have inherited wealth will very much struggle even to survive, let alone to thrive. And that cannot be right.
Do you think we'll ever get to a stage of things like universal basic income?
So the Welsh trial with care leavers, I've looked at with great interest. But again, this is back to the point. So I read a really funny thing the other day, which was, I'd like a recount. I don't want AI painting pictures and writing poetry. I want it doing my household chores so I can do those things. But again, I'm sorry to sound a bit floppy about this, but it's good. The progressive movement needs to be offering the Labour Party solutions that they can legislate in Parliament. The notion that, having said all that stuff about how poorly we've been governed, good government is very much about getting out of the way, setting a framework and then letting the mayors and others get on with it at the local level, which is where we'd like to be. But the thing is that the scale of the change is such that they need friends, they need people working up how to do things differently, and they need voices that they can lean into and the voices that they can trust.
I was quite encouraged when they started talking about citizens' assemblies, because it just offers that route in for insight. The thing that worries me historically over the past 14 years is the over-reliance on Tufton Street, and looking at the insight that was coming out of there.
The point is, the Truss Kwarteng budget, let them rewrite that. It was an unfunded campaign of tax cuts, which completely crashed the stock market. Another act of self-harm from crazily deluded people who felt that it was doable. And as a result, we are all paying more for our mortgages and for our rent. That causal connection cannot just be dropped. These things aren't inevitable. They're the result of mismanagement of the economy. So we spent 1.4 trillion the last year of COVID, and the supposed spending like a drunken sailor of Gordon Brown, his last year's government spending was 555 billion. It's trebled, and it hasn't gone down since the pandemic. So we've recalibrated up to the power of 2 against what Gordon Brown was doing when they were funding Sure Start and they were funding interventions. We've been ripped off.
Exactly. It's back to that question of where's the money gone?
So yes, so in some ways there are reasons to be cheerful, because again, the progressive movement and a northern policy movement can influence what comes next. But the thing is that the constraints are such that the counter voice, and the Spectator and the Telegraph have been, to all intents and purposes, running the country for 14 years, and they are not going to say, oh, how nice, Angela, crack on. They're going to come out and they're going to fight. And as I say, I think that this stuff's going to get a lot more pointy, and then we're going to have a sort of there's be a lot of upheaval in the next 2 years. And I think that Keir will, as I've said, have a kind of very brief honeymoon, and then the British people are going to be demanding that he fixes all of this quickly. And I think he'll have poor opinion polling ratings quickly. And it's very hard to govern and be changed. What does they say to Obama? How's that hopey changey thing going for you now? So essentially there's a lot of it, which is, if they do have a big majority, they have to be brave early on. Because, as I say, the continual sort of woke, anti-woke, there's progressive, and then the backlash, and the backlash to the backlash, and all of that. This stuff is so febrile in terms of power structures. In fact, I was talking to a friend last night who was saying, oh, things like Black Lives Matter, they just came and went. And I was a bit like, no, I feel like there is a network of change movements that haven't managed to move the dial yet, but that could. We need an economy which is inclusive in terms of you have as much chance to thrive as a woman, as a man, as a person of colour, as somebody who's white British. We're a long way from these things. And also what's interesting to me is, in the 90s, if you had said to me that the whole cabinet would be full of old Etonians and it was all about kind of old money, I would have laughed at you, because I think that we were very complacent, that a lot of those battles had been won, and of course you'd expect to see a representative government, so Tony Blair's gender and racial mix of his MPs. But we've seen a real narrowing of that, again, of who gets to say and who's in charge, and a return of the public schools as the locus of all this stuff. And there's fights on all fronts, essentially. And there's a lot to play for.
I could talk to you all day. There's one thing I'm going to finish up with. I think looking at the challenges that lie ahead for Labour, if you really want to look into what I think my view is as they come in, there's an amazing book called A Very British Coup by Chris Mullin that actually captures a lot of the challenges that I fully expect Keir to await Keir when he comes into office. But equally, that should really galvanise people, because if we want to look to where we want to be as a society, as a country, we have to really start back with more of a compelling vision and narrate that to the general population about this is what we really want to achieve next 5-10 years ahead, because in all honesty, it's going to be at least a 2-term to get a lot of these elements in. So there just needs to be that constant loop back to the public about this is why we're doing it, and just more openness and honesty about the challenges that are there. Yeah, it's going to be turbulent, but equally, Keir also has an opportunity ahead of him to really set the UK on a fresh course. And I think if we start looking more about what optimistic futures may look like and how this could interweave the entire country to a progressive growth and progressive change, then we have an opportunity to really
that's a nice positive note to
push
end
the
on.
dial as to
And
what we have.
of course, opportunity is spatially concentrated, but talent is not. Yes, I agree. We'll see how it all pans out, but it does feel like the to-do list is rather long.
Definitely. I'm sure we'll chat again, because this will probably be the first of many conversations, but
No
thank you
worries.
so much for your time.
Soon.
It's been an absolute pleasure.